Yeah, I'm going to basically talk. I mean, you kind of look at this, you go, what is he going to talk about? America's moment, transformation of our global 21st century world. I'm going to make an argument, essentially, that we are literally on the cusp of potentially an era in America that has really only been, there's analogies to maybe 4 times in American history. And that if we do this right, we're going to play a prime part in essentially the creation of helping create this 21st century world, which is long overdue to get built. And although it's going to have an American focus, it's definitely a global point of view here, but but I really want to make this case. It's a little controversial, and we'll see what you think about it, but I'm going to make this case to you. Now, Chris actually he stole that a little bit there, because he said, hey, talk a little bit about your background. My background is always, I like to kind of stay at the front. I'm always looking at the future. I'm always looking at the next big story. And I originally was a journalist, and in fact, I was in a foreign correspondent in Asia back in the late 80s. In fact, I was in China right after Tiananmen Square, among other things. That was the front story of that time, the rise of Asia in the late 80s. I then came back to the States to get in the very earliest internet story, and was among the 3 first professional hires at Wired magazine. So it's the very earliest days of Wired when we started to, everyone thought we were kind of nuts talking about this digital revolution thing. I then moved to a place called Global Business Network, which is where I met, actually, Chris. And GBN was essentially a place that was really trying to get their hands around globalization, big long-term trends, and helping governments and big global corporations really think 10, 20 years out and thinking about the future. That's essentially what I was working on there, which is going to play a part in here. And ultimately, in 2004, though, I shifted to politics, which you're going to see here a little bit. And I could see that there was this opening in politics to start moving new technology, new media into politics. And this was 4 years ago. It was 2004 when I made the shift right after that, the election there. And so the last 4 years have obviously seen an explosion of the use of that. And I was very involved in, even as far up as the Obama campaign here, and was how do you actually use these tools for electoral politics. My latest thing, though, that I'm working on is essentially a company called Next Agenda, which I've now founded, and it's essentially a way that we're trying to figure out how to use these tools and new technologies to bring many more people into the process of policymaking or governing, which I think is the next big wave that you're going to see happening in this tech field vis-a-vis government. So if the last 4 years is about electoral politics using these tools, I think this next one you're going to see is going to be about governing and policymaking, at least as one big theme story that I'm going to be working on. But I'm actually going to step back from a little bit what I'm up to and frame the situation for the world right here. And we are really up against the wall. I mean, if you really take all the challenges that are really still very much live challenges, you have to say the globalization of everything, essentially, but one of the things here that's really kind of how the interconnection of the global economy, we really haven't figured out how to finesse that. And then even issues like water, we haven't even begun to do this. This is a emerging issue of great proportion. Many parts of the world, including California, is getting a little bit of a drought here, but places like Australia now is in their 8th year of drought. I mean, we are like in serious water problems are right around the corner here. Anyhow, big, huge challenges that would be daunting to any generation of Americans, but essentially it's our legacy now. In fact, here I just kind of, boom, threw up if you had to grab your dozen big ones. Any one of these is a 20-year project to solve these things. And frankly, we actually, as an era here, we have to help really figure out all these at the same time. Now, I'm going to just focus on one quickly here, just to drive home the change. Not that, and maybe not be too many non-believers here on climate change, but I just want to show you the numbers. In my new company, we're focusing on this issue of transition to clean energy and the need to really take on climate change. And one of the guys we've been working with is a guy named Saul Griffith, who's just a brilliant entrepreneur in wind energy. And these slides are from him, so I want to give credit where credit's due. But this is, for example, CO2 concentrations of the last 1,000 years in the atmosphere. And if you want to see that line, that is the line that's been going on. So when people argue about, are we really affecting this thing? That's it. This is essentially temperature changes around the world for the last quarter century. Every dot there shows temperature going up and blues down. The entire world essentially is warming up at a very, very furious pace in historical terms. If you look at world energy consumption here, the world consumes 18 terawatts of energy a year. Terawatts being, a massive number here. The breakdown of where that energy comes from, coal here, oil here, plants, still a lot of burning here. This is solar is that little sliver, wind is that little sliver, geothermal, the kind of renewables is just an absolute fraction of what the world energy consumption is right now. So we are way overextended. If you look at energy consumption by sector, where does energy get consumed? You know, we think, oh, it's all about electricity or something. That's just a small slice. Agriculture, huge energy consumption. Manufacturing, forestry, frankly, cooking and heating, roads. This is just transportation here. It's like we're really, you know, massive energy consumption on all these fronts. If you take U.S. energy consumption from 1900 to 2000, look at the growth in our energy consumption, but look at coal, natural gas. This is coal, natural gas, petroleum. And again, what we think of as renewables is just skimming the surface up here. Look at the growth. This is the carbon energy that everyone's talking about. We got to do something about. If you look at energy consumption by activity, you know, industry, cooking, air conditioning, electrical generation, and again, the breakdown of where it's coming from. Overwhelmingly, the blues are carbon, and these little touches here, and this is nuclear actually here, and these are the kind of the renewables. So what we've got is essentially about as thoroughly a rooted global economy in carbon energy as possible. Now, if we wanted to get to the clean energy economy, this is just, so I'm throwing one of these issues just to give you a sense of what we're up against. The potential of renewables is insane. I mean, of course, the amount of solar energy hitting the planet at any good time, you know, could more than, you know, all we have to hit is 18 terawatts, right? Heat, underground, nuclear actually is limitless too. Basically, there are ways to do that. Now, you know, nuclear has got its own other potential problems, but it's essentially carbonless. So basically what we've got to do, this is the U.S. energy distribution, if you want to put it. We've essentially, this is today, and this is what we have to get to essentially in the next 25 years. We got to go from this is fossil fuels and this is renewables. We've got to drop fossil fuels and get to renewables. So when you hear global warming and you hear about climate change problems, the level of change ahead of us is insane. I mean, you really have to wrap your head around a different set of numbers here. In fact, someone like Al Gore has actually calculated this out as even if in 10 years we try to get the U.S. electric grid off of this is our current, essentially, lineup of how our electricity comes from coal, natural gas, petroleum, again, up here. This is what we would have to get a full renewable kind of thing, from wind, biomass, efficiency. You'd still have to have, in almost all of these, there's a nuclear component. That alone is a huge and very difficult problem. Solvable, yes. Totally technologically feasible, yes. But it's really an immense challenge. So it's, again, now, and if you did this, you would have to transform the energy grid. You'd have to really do something about transportation. You'd have to essentially have a way to interconnect these things informationally. You'd have to reorganize urban footprints, and you'd have to have highly efficient housing. If you really take climate change seriously, we're talking about a massive reorganization. Now, so that's the kind of challenge we're kind of up against here when we're talking about this. So one way to think about where we're at, essentially, as a culture is we're essentially going at from the 20th to 21st, we're going from a kind of a nationally organized world into a much more globally interconnected world. We're going from, we have to get off kind of carbon energy through this century into some kind of clean energy future. We have to basically go from some kind of unsustainable kind of way that we're currently going to a much more sustainable one with much less footprint, 9 billion people on the planet. And ultimately, we've got to essentially think of it as a 20th to a 21st century transition, which we have yet to do. So it's a big transition that, in historical terms, we're up against. And so there is, and here's your kind of Apple innovation here, there is a need for innovation on a massive scale globally in the world. And one of the things that Americans do good, I know do well, and I know there's other nationalities represented here, is Americans do technological innovation and innovation extremely well. So from a global point of view, this is a time for Americans to really step up. This would be a time where we could really do actually make a really big impact on how the rest of the world goes too. Now, fortunately, there is actually this phalanx of challenges and problems coincides with an incredibly rare political opening in America. And there's a lot of talk about Obama's election and you know, how did this kind of African-American guy win and come out of nowhere kind of things. But what's actually going on here, I think, can be explained on a deeper level, not by him himself or everything, but there is essentially a phenomena happening here in the country that I would argue has happened 4 times in American history. American history has been studded with these moments where the existing politics, the existing system essentially almost goes into a collapse or a free fall, and you watch a kind of about a ride of 10 to 20 years of innovation that come up through politics, but through the whole society, until you kind of reinvent American society and for another run. This happened, in my analysis, and we can go into deeper if we don't have the time here. It happened in 1800 with Thomas Jefferson, and essentially it was the birth of the Democratic Party. There was essentially, they called it the Revolution of 1800, and there was about 20 years of innovation in both politics and also the economy, much more kind of democratized economy. It happened around the Civil War, obviously, and that was the beginning of the Republican Party. Everyone thinks that just as slavery, but in fact, it was a riot of innovation. They introduced land grants, the Homestead Act, giving away land out. They built out the railroads. They did all kinds of things. Universities, public education, higher education. Tons of things happened in the spirit of about 10 years there, 20 years. Happened around the early 20th century. Teddy Roosevelt was kicked that one off, but it ended up, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. And ultimately, it happened in the middle of this century, as we know, around the Great Depression. The question is, and I don't want to get partisan here, is to what extent you might be seeing something with the collapse of the kind of 25 years of the conservative kind of run here in American government, whether you're watching another kind of era opening up here and whether Obama's in that case. I would argue essentially, and again, not from a partisan point of view, that I think we are actually in something different here. Now, what happens in all these cases, just to make the case for this, is they're always prompted by two things. One, deep structural changes of the country, like the fundamental economy, the way we work. We go from agrarian to urban environments, or agricultural economies to industrial economies, something like that. Or we face some kind of challenge that the country has never faced before. This has happened again and again. The other thing that happens to solve it, there's always these three elements that seem to happen. They're usually rooted around some kind of tech and media transformation, historically. They're almost always, or they always are associated with a massive population change that reconfigures the politics or the configuration of people to solving this problem. And ultimately, there's a bunch of new ideas that make sense of how you do this. Now, just to give you one little thread to kind of explain this here, the last time, or not the last time, but one big time, it's the obvious one, was the turn of the century of 1900s, where you watched essentially a transition to this urban industrial transformation. And that was essentially associated with what we call the classic progressive era in American history here. Now, what happened is they had a very similar, at that time, new tools. They had essentially, this was the first time of the rise of the giant newspapers. You basically had a whole new bunch of people coming into politics. Women didn't have the vote until that period. Urban immigrants coming from Europe, and ultimately had a ton of new ideas of how to get that raw capitalism under control. And so again, this is our kind of internet of the time, was the mass circulation. This was the kind of bloggers of that time, the muckrakers. You had basically the younger generation at that time was called the missionary generation. They were these kind of crusading young people, similar to what you saw behind Obama. And you also had all these immigrants coming from Europe, as opposed to this now, our generation coming from Asia and Latin America. And ultimately, in the space of, again, 15 years, you essentially busted up these great, robber baron things. There was progressive income tax, which came out of nowhere. You watched women's vote, unionization happen. You watched child safe labor ends, FDA standards. A bunch of things just came boom, boom, boom. And also in California here, all these recall stuff. This kind of just exploded, and then it died in about 15 years. It just went boom. Now, the question is, are we entering one of those things there now? There's a lot of talk about we were. We'll see if we are. Now, what's driving our time? That structural deep changes. We're watching these huge technology shifts, as we well know. Technology, the internet, all this stuff that you guys are familiar with. The great structural reframing of our time is the globalization of everything. I mean, this is every bit as much of the dragging through, the kind of reworking the fabric of American society, and actually societies around the world, in the same way that we watch kind of people being taken off the farms into the big urban cities. This is going to be seen in 50 years or 100 years or 200 years as the story of the early 21st century, is essentially the globalization of everything. And ultimately, we have all these unprecedented challenges, like climate change. Like 30 years ago, who would have thought we'd be facing something as crazy as having to reverse the change in the climate of the planet? So what's interesting, though, is we have the same three pieces that have come together in these other eras. One, we've got the tools, obviously the computer and internet stuff that I don't have to lecture you guys on. Two, which I am going to talk a little bit more on with you, is the American society is going through the biggest transformation of its population ever since the early 20th century. In fact, the scale of immigration is at the same level, and we are also watching the rise of the biggest generation in American history, which is all the young people under 30, which some of which are in this audience today. And ultimately, we've got all these new ways to solve these new challenges. So what I'm going to do here in the rest of the talk quickly is at least give you some little something in the argument of those three pillars of what's really going on today in those three pieces. I'll give you some sense that, in fact, we might be in a similar historical opening. Now, this group, I don't have to talk about the changes in technology, the internet, what's driving it. There's other technologies that if I had more time we could talk about, but which I'll give briefly here, is there's a wave of maturing technologies that are actually, from a world historical level, are actually ready now, teed up, in the same way that I would say information technology was teed up in the early 90s. And so I think what you're starting to see now, in fact, it's very interesting. I was here in the early 90s with Wired Magazine where we were kind of talking about this, the power of these new tools and this information in the early Apple and that kind of stuff. You're actually watching a very similar spirit and a very similar kind of underestimated potential in almost all these fields happening right now in the Valley and beyond. I think there's some really interesting parallels there. Biotech, again, just to keep in context here, data on this stuff. Small, you know, think about this is the internet in the early kind of 90s. It's like that's how many companies are here, small. They've actually started to get, the first decade, they've never had more than 5 drug vaccines now. Now they're hitting 30 a year. They're starting to scale up. The biotech industry has now gone from 200,000 to 500,000, and it's about to scale up yet again. There's a kind of an early boom going on there. Clean tech, similar thing. We're kind of living in the middle of this now. But just to give you some kind of numbers, venture capital in 2007, that's how much VC money went into clean tech. By 2008, it basically was boom, doubled. And although this last year was so wacky because of the global meltdown, we're watching that kind of scaling up going on in the clean tech space. That's just, and then ultimately nanotech, which is manufacturing at an atomic level, thought of as science fiction 20 years ago, is now you've got real companies actually doing these products now. One that I know quite well is NanoSolar. I know the founder quite well. Got $500 million of investment. They've got real plants going now here in Silicon Valley. They are essentially manufacturing self-assembly at the bottom up, and they're dropping the cost of solar energy because they have flexible solar out of this by 80%. Very, very interesting, drop, which people aren't expecting. Huge breakthroughs coming around the corner on how you can actually manufacture cheaper than the grid, cheaper than coal, cheaper than the dirtiest coal, is actually real technologies that are doing this right now. The other quick thing you guys know about, I just want to give you the power of this thing. You guys know all about the internet here, so I'm going to skip this quickly. But I do want to give you the numbers just to remind you how this is happening. We're watching this collapse. We predicted this back in the 90s, and we all were talking about this, but every one of these industries is fundamentally in collapse right now, or fundamentally, not collapse, shaken, seriously shaken. The executives in every one of these is extremely difficult times right now. The one that is just astounding is essentially newspapers. Newspapers have lost, from their peak circulation in '84, which was when your Mac came out, they've lost basically 50% of the circulation. It's actually gone up now since this number was here. Half their business has been lost in that space. Boom, collapsing going on. And of course, we know the numbers here. I don't have to necessarily, I'll go through this really quickly because I think some of these numbers, the YouTube numbers, you know quite well. But this one is actually really interesting. Facebook now is essentially, if a nation, it's essentially the 5th largest nation in the world. And they are essentially adding 700,000 new users a day. A day. 2/3 of them are now outside the United States. Phone is interesting too. There was a long time. Now we have got the entire U.S. population, more mobile subscribers now than landlines. And now there are more text messages sent every day than phone calls. We have now moved into essentially a different way. And globally, and this is the really interesting numbers now, we've now got essentially 20% of the world is online. We've got now 60% have mobile phones, which is astounding. That in 10 years, essentially 60% of the world has gotten it. 800 million people now get online through phones. So again, think about the whole planet. We actually are coming within sight of essentially a totally interconnected planet. Now, for you guys, I want to basically shift to the second piece, which is the demographic shift in the country. And this is creating a new political kind of coalition, you could say. Think of it not so much in part, it is have a partisan overtone, but essentially it's essentially a change-oriented constituencies are building here. Now, the millennial generation is those young people 30 and under. So you go actually literally from 30 to about age 12. It's essentially people in their 20s and their teens. This is the American population, the age pyramid. Old people up here, young people here, men and women. This is in 2015. This is the baby boom crew that's getting older and older here. By the way, these were age pyramids because they always were like shaped like pyramids until the baby boom, and so who won't die off in an organized fashion here. So there is a distortion in the age pyramid going on here. But the reason I'm putting it up here is not for the boomers so much. It's to say this is the millennial generation. It is bigger than the baby boom. It is it is the biggest generation in American history, and it is making its presence felt extremely profoundly all across the economy, but also in politics. And one of the reasons is every generation has a personality, and I could give a whole talk on this thing, but I'll give you a few things about these young people. And again, there's people in this room who come from this generation. They are the most diverse generation in American history. 40% of them are from non-white, minority groups, or will soon be the majority groups, as you'll see here in a minute. They're the most educated generation in American history. By far, even though all the ring in the hands of like, oh my God, the state of education, is absolutely no comparison to how many of these have been through higher education. They are essentially the most global generation. 20% of all college students now spend time abroad in a way that in my generation was almost unheard of, very rare thing to do. They're the most extremely civic-minded generation in terms of their involvement in the voting patterns and their volunteerism. 80% of the people in this generation volunteer. At least it's not weekly. I think it's within a month they will do some kind of volunteer effort. Blows away every other generation in terms of their volunteerism. And ultimately, they're very, very can-do, kind of optimistic group. Now, the politics of this is why one of the reasons Obama was so successful was this crew. I want to say there's been a trending going on here with this group. Even though Bush beat Kerry in 2004, if just these young people voted, it would have been a Kerry landslide, a total landslide there. If in the midterms of 2006, they were voting at that kind of level, Democrat to Republican, and this is the kind of general election with Obama. They essentially more than doubled Republican to Democrat. This is, again, almost unheard of in generational terms. Generations never have that kind of big a split. It's a huge split. It's quite amazing. It was over 2-to-1 kind of vote. And ultimately, if just the young people voted in this last election, it would have almost been a complete... there's a few places where young people will still vote, wouldn't have voted for Obama, but it's quite extraordinary. There's no demographic group that's close to that. And of course, they know all this new technology. Now, the second group, though, that's the other piece that you got to understand, and you know it kind of from being around in California here, but it's really amazing to look at the numbers here, is the Hispanic population. This is conservative estimates show that by 2050, 30% of the entire American population will be of Hispanic descent. 30%. And in fact, if you look at the entire American population, not just Hispanics, but if you just take the white population and minority population, this includes Asians and all minorities, there was a shift here. This is the percentage of minorities in the country starting in 1960 when we consciously changed U.S. immigration policy to open up to Latin America and Asia. This has been the growth. This has been the corresponding, since this is a percentage, decline of the percentage of the population of being white. This is a today, which again to foreign audiences when I talk makes Obama much more understandable of how that can happen. This is a very conservative estimate of when it'll actually cross. It's been shifting. By 2050, you essentially have this is essentially an equal. Whites will be a minority. This has actually been dropping. It's not about 2047, they're saying. This is California today, just out of curiosity, or not out of curiosity, to point it out. And right today in the United States, this is the Hispanic populations in the border states and also inside here. This is, again, huge coalition, and just from a political point of view, just to talk about change-oriented, because they're kind of more change-oriented kind of constituencies. These are the ways they've been shifting, overwhelmingly for Obama as well, away from the Republicans. So I just want to say there are two giant constituencies coming together, both change-oriented because Minorities are not as invested in the status quo, and young people are never as invested in the status quo. They're coming together in a way towards change. So I just want to say, when you think about what it's going to take to change these things, there is something to be said that with these new technologies, with these constituencies, you could actually watch a big change quickly. The final thing I just want to mention here is the last thing is we have to figure out how to solve these things. And again, the daunting slate of what we got is pretty amazing. But I will say this, we've got these incredible tools. I mean, the ability of technologies, there's three attributes of technology applied to this problem solving that is extremely encouraging. One is technology's ability to scale allows us to bring many more people into whatever process they touch on. And that is what we have to do to start figuring out. In my case, we're starting to think about how do you bring more people into figuring out solving public problems? Or how do you get just more people figuring out how to solve climate change? In the old days, you'd have the inner circle. Even in kind of current think tank land, you can kind of get 100 people max. And ultimately, though, with technology, you can start to think, how are we going to get many more people solving this? The other thing is, technology allows parallel processing, partly through the same scaling phenomena. But this is a server farm. It's the old classic thing. In the old days of computing, we all thought, well, if we just got the hugely smart supercomputer, it would be the best computer. And then someone thought about it in the late 90s, said, well, what if we parsed out a problem and distributed amongst little kind of computers, desktops, and then reassembled the answers with lightning-fast telecommunications? You could be smarter than supercomputers, which is essentially what server farms are, what Google does. That essentially is a way to get applied in a broader way to these solutions. So yeah, it's daunting. So if you had all those issues I was mentioning on that basic chart there, if you just had the government focus on one of them, it's going to be daunting to get to all of them. But there's no reason you can't basically parallel process on this stuff, again, using technological processes to really get these things working on a much different space. And then the final thing we know, which is a big thing about the collapse of space, there's always been this sense in problem solving that you had to gather people physically to solve the problem, right? And we all know, and you guys are in the tech business, how we're now watching the collapse of space and Skype, free Skype all over the world, and all these different ways you can connect up people differently. Again, huge potential. And so basically, without kind of doing a promo here, I just want to mention that is the problem I'm trying to attack in my current job. And this is, oh, geez. This is, that's our animated logo. But we're basically trying to, we got this website's just going to be launching in September. We're doing our first big event here, September 17th, actually, in the Presidio. We are essentially trying to attack a problem. How can America get all its electricity from clean energy as fast as possible? And we're trying to use it both physically gathering people and scaling them up online to do a 6-month project to try to come up with new kind of thinking on how to do that. And then after that, we're going to try to hit on other kinds of challenges over time. So anyhow, I don't want to get into the details of my thing there. Woo! That's the way out. But I will basically say this to wrap up and leave a little time for some questions. Get us back to this scream. It is really serious. I mean, I was trying to give you some of those numbers on climate change to kind of give you a sense of it. But we really are up against it. And we really are essentially at a cusp between essentially going from an organized society of the 20th century, which worked brilliantly in many respects, on its own terms, in terms of the prosperity, boom of prosperity, the freedom it gave individuals, particularly in this country, but it just is running into some constraints. It just ain't working and can't keep going down this road. And so we've got to watch, we've got to go through this transition. If it takes 10, 20, 30, it might be 50 years. Basically, it might be the project of the people in this life, in this room, our lives. But essentially, we have to move into a different kind of thing here. Now, as daunting as that is, though, I want to just make this point that every time the country has gotten in this situation, they felt exactly the same way. Totally the same way. And in fact, the last one I will just go to is the one that everyone's been kind of making reference to with, in recent times here because of the collapse of the global economy and various things and the depression analysis here. But we look back at this era of America as like, you know, having solved some pretty amazing things. Not just the depression, but it was also the rise of Hitler. It was also the rise of the communist countries. The nuclear war was brewing just after his time. Anyhow, there was a huge challenge, a global challenge at the time, international at that time, that really no one knew what to do. When he was elected, people look back now, his New Deal really did all this stuff to help solve the Depression. He had no idea what to do. He had stolen, the New Deal was essentially a slogan stolen from a magazine writer, was essentially just written out on a napkin, kind of before a rally he talked about. When he came into office, got sworn in his inauguration, he essentially called a bank holiday for a week, shut down all the banks, and he literally told his advisors, get anyone who knows anything about banking in a room, and don't let them get out until they come up with an idea. I mean, it was that level of kind of not had a plan in motion. But what they did have is an entrepreneurial attitude, a trial and error thing, and they would beg, borrow, steal ideas. They'd try stuff. If it didn't work, they'd try something else. And eventually, they kind of worked their way through it. They took the technologies at their resources then, and that human resources they had, and at that time the technology was, chalk and a bunch of white guys. And it was always white guys. This, by the way, this is Vannevar Bush, who was his science advisor, and is credited as the first person to really envision the World Wide Web. He talked about thinking machines that could connect all the world's information, and he's largely now still thought of as the guy who first could see that. But anyhow, in general, they just had this very small coteries of people working out these ideas. They had their same three pillars. In that time, the kind of internet and computers of their time was essentially radio and broadcast technologies. The great shifts in population of their time was they had this GI generation. This is the greatest generation that Brokaw and all these guys are talking about, the ones that won the war and the Rosie Riveters and the post-war boom folks. Had 8 consecutive American presidents came out of that generation. I mean, it was one of the great civic-minded, amazing generations, very much like I would say the parallel with the millennials potential will be. It also had huge immigration from Europe that was matured by that time, the Italians and the Irish, and that kind of came of age and built essentially a political coalition for big changes. And ultimately they had all these new ideas, again, not off the bat, but ultimately had a bunch of new ideas how to do this. And so basically, in this space, and this is again to remind you how fast these things can happen. From 32, they had no clue, and by the end of World War II, essentially, they had come up with, essentially, this is like 15 years, they had essentially figured out a way out by using government stimulus to get the American economy and the world economy ultimately, helpfully, out of the Great Depression. They had figured out a way to defeat fascism and contain communism with nuclear balance. It was a little bit later than the 15 years, but ultimately a new way of security that lasted for 50 years. They had built out this took 3 years, came up with the United Nations, World Bank, IMF, Bretton Woods Accord. All these things were done out of whole cloth, new ideas, new institutions. They had all these things, GI Bill, mortgages, all this stuff, Social Security came out of literally 15 years, and ultimately you had all these other things came out. This is more the 60s. But the point is, explosion of innovation happened very quickly. And now we look back on the old guy just about to die and say, oh my God, why don't we have people like that anymore? You got to put it in context. They start scared and have no idea, and ultimately you end up figuring it out. So the question is, and again, not to, are we in a similar situation? I think we're the parallel is very, very similar. And one of the things I would just say to the folks here is this is kind of the Hopi Indian saying that Obama used to use actually at rallies is, we can't wait for another generation of people. We can't say, well, they'll figure it out in 2050 or whatever else. And that's a good thing because if you look back, if we look at our human resources compared to their human resources, this is just one little comparison here. This is the number of college-educated Americans in 1940. This starts at 40, even though it says 50 there. It's 50. 1940, it was less than 5% of the American population had a college education. Today, it's 30%. If you take raw numbers, there's less than 6 million in 1940. There's 86 million now. Who would you rather have to draw off of to figure out solving problems? 15 times more. The second thing is our technologies. If you would have told FDR, hey, we're going to put this thing on your desk, or better yet, we're going to give it to you in your hand like this, and you can ask any question in the world and get all the world's information in a second, he would have said it was like magic. I mean, it was just completely out of the question. And now it's like every 5-year-old in the country knows how to Google stuff, Incredible kind of technology we have here. So I would just say we have all the resources and all the technology and all the basic aspects to basically pull that transition off, to get into that, from that coal to kind of clean tech, to basically move it into that more sustainable society, to figure out this new interconnected, totally integrated global society, interconnecting all across the world. And it's basically kind of come down, though, to everybody, you guys, all of us, figuring this out together. And it's the project for the next 20, 30 years. So anyhow, that's the end, and that's me. Thank you.